If you ask your average player what the most dangerous monster in D&D is, you'll probably get a variety of answers, but I'd wager the most common one would be dragons. Not only is half the game named after them, but they're at the apex of every food chain they so choose to partake in. They are not only big and strong enough to physically dominate pretty much anything they cross paths with, but they also have a suite of powerful abilities, and most importantly, they're really smart, at least for the most part. They also live long enough lives to capitalize on all of that, ultimately becoming something rivaled by very few creatures in any D&D monster manual, which is what makes them so utterly terrifying when they harness the powers of undeath. Many of you are probably familiar with the concept of a Draco-Lich, a dragon who's achieved lichdom, becoming one of the most fearsome types of undead wrapped in the body of the most fearsome type of creature. But lichdom is not the only possible fate that can befall a dragon in undeath. Under very rare circumstances, some of them may rise as something just as, if not even more terrible, a vampire dragon. On its face, the concept of a vampire dragon is a fairly simple one. We all know what a vampire is. They're creepy old dudes or ladies who may or may not look young and may or may not sparkle, and also may or may not have bald heads, hunched postures, and pointed teeth, but sometimes are well groomed and finely dressed, living in a mansion, maybe a catacomb, or also maybe a farmhouse in, I want to say, Louisiana, and they can never go in the sun except for when they can, and also they love to count stuff on children's television. Okay, so maybe the concept of a vampire isn't as simple as I thought. There are a lot of different stories and traditions out there, but at least as far as D&D goes, the idea of what a vampire is pretty consistent for the most part. The vampire section of the new monster manual is more or less just a greatest hits album of vampire tropes, with your familiars at the bottom, Spawn a step above them, Nightbringers and vampires as your Nosferatus and Draculas, respectively, and at the tippity top, you have the Umbral Lord, which is basically just the boss vampire. You'll notice that all of these creatures are humanoids, but that doesn't mean vampirism is exclusive to those of us with 2 legs, 2 arms, and a head. Vampirism is for everyone. But aside from being humanoid in shape, all of these creatures have a few traits in common, all of which apply to the vampire dragon, for the most part. They're undead, they take damage in direct sunlight, and they need permission before entering someone's abode. The only vampire weakness that doesn't apply to vampire dragons is that rule about running water, because for some reason, while running water does acid damage to vampires, it has no effect on vampire dragons. The Draconomicon from 3rd edition, which is of course the only source book for vampire dragons that we have, doesn't really explain why that's true, but nonetheless, they are free to frolic in the water to their draconic heart's content. What this book does tell us, though, is pretty much everything else there is to know about these guys. Unsurprisingly, a dragon being turned into a vampire is an extremely rare event. It only really happens if the dragon's corpse is subject to some very specific necromantic rituals, or of course if the dragon is slain by a vampire's bite. But not all dragons can become vampires, only those who are fully grown can successfully undergo the transition. I know the little kid vampire is a trope amongst human vampires and all, but for dragons, that ain't how it works. If an attempt is made to turn a young dragon, they rise from the grave as a zombie, which is still terrifying in a way, but not nearly as dangerous as the vampire, mostly because they don't keep their mental faculties intact. They inherit most of the vampire's abilities, including their penchant for charming other creatures, though in the dragon's case, all of their charm and domination abilities are upgraded from charm or dominate person to charm or dominate monster, which makes sense given that they are indeed not humanoids. This makes them so much more dangerous, but more on that in a minute. First, I need to talk about some of the changes I made when updating these guys into 5th edition. Because while the concept of a vampire dragon is awesome, and their stat block is generally solid, much like the vampire muse I talked about last week, there is so much untapped potential here, and I intend to tap it. Wait, can we take that again? But before I dive into that, you know I gotta give a shout out to this week's sponsor, Enshrined. Enshrined is a really dope mythic horror D&D setting that is currently on Kickstarter, and it looks awesome. It's an entire game world based on a mysterious island containing the last fragments of the material plane. People live alongside chained up gods, tons of unique flora, fauna, and monsters. The book also introduces something called the Creed Mark, which is a system handcrafted to provide a flexible framework for not just tracking the party's relationship with external entities like a local guild, a god, or an important NPC, but also encouraging them to engage with building those relationships in one way or another, taking the player all the way from initiation to the highest rung on the potential ladder, complete with problems, adventures, and conflicts along their chosen path. There are also a bunch of new classes, spells, items, creatures, and of course a ton of really great, well thought out lore for the setting itself. They're also tapping into some of the less explored parts of D&D, like crafting, alchemy, and factions, to not just give you some useful tools for this setting, but tools that will be great to have on hand for pretty much any D&D game you run in the future. As a big fan of both horror and the mythic storytelling, I am super jazzed about the project, and I highly encourage you to follow the link in the description down below and check it out for yourself. Thank you very much to Enshrine for bringing us here this week to talk about a creature that has been on my list for literal years. Speaking of, let's go over how to make this dragon not suck while it actively sucks the life out of its enemies. 3rd edition D&D handled concepts like the vampire dragon in a very different way from 5e. Anytime there was a creature that was a base creature with some kind of enhancement rather than a bespoke stat block, 3rd edition would just give you a template. For example, there wasn't a Draco Lich stat block in 3rd edition, instead there was a template of additional rules and features that you would add on to an existing dragon stat block along with a list of things that you would take away, and that would theoretically allow you to turn any dragon into a Lich. This is actually true even in D&D 5e, where the Draco Lich uses a template, albeit a much more specific and narrow one, and while we used to have hella templates in 3rd edition, 5e has moved away from this idea a lot, with Draco Liches, Shadow Dragons, Half Dragons, and Myconid Spore Servants being the only true templates in the core monster manual. In the 2024 rules, they seem to have moved away from this design idea entirely, just giving you a single stat block or two that are representative of most creatures of that type, leaving you to fill in the blanks if you're designing a specific NPC. There are pros and cons to both approaches, with neither being truly perfect, but the first thing I needed to decide was if I wanted the vampire dragon to be a template or a specific stat block, and while normally I'm actually a big fan of templates, much like the Draco Lich, the vampire dragon is such a specific creature that I felt the 2024 approach was the best way to go forward with this one. If this was a situation where the dragon could be any age and the base creature changed literally anything about the final form of the creature, I probably would have gone the template route, but because the dragon has to be fully grown as an adult before it can even become a vampire, a template felt like an overcomplicated solution to a relatively easy problem. So with all of that said, let's look at this thing, shall we? It of course has all the things you'd expect from a vampire, including a slashing attack that does necrotic damage, the ability to charm as a bonus action, and of course, the vampire weakness trait with all the rules for every vampire's grudge match against the sun, front doors, and sticks. It also has the vampire's signature ability to shapeshift, although as a massive creature, instead of turning into a little wisp of mist, it becomes a 15-foot cloud of mist, which otherwise functions in the same way. It can sneak through cracks in the wall, escape through an open window if wounded, all the usual stuff. And by using the vampire's misty escape trait, that is especially handy on account of the fact that, like all true vampires, the vampire dragon can't be killed unless it is in direct sunlight or if it is severely wounded in its resting place. Which brings us to our first major deviation. While a coffin might be fine for your average mortal to sleep in after they become a vampire dragon would need a comedically large wooden box, let alone a place to keep it, so instead of returning to a casket each dawn, they are bound to their hoard. What's really fun about this is, like all dragons, the vampire dragon keeps a hoard. However, the nature of their hoard is obviously influenced by what type of dragon the vampire was before turning into a creature of the night. A black dragon, for instance, is still going to have its hoard of relics from fallen empires, and a gold dragon turned vampire is still going to have its collection of artisanal treasures and magic items, but once they pass the threshold into undeath, their hoard gradually becomes more macabre and corrupt. much like the dragon itself. A blue dragon, notorious for hoarding capable underlings, might begin to show more interest in recruiting necromancers and other experts of undeath, and that gold dragon's hoard might start to fill up with magical artifacts that are all incredibly well made and beautiful to look at still, but with more of a focus toward magic items that can help them further their goals in undead overlordship rather than as a benevolent protector. The hoard of a black dragon probably isn't going to change all that much. They've been given serial killer vibes from day one, but maybe they take a special interest in the blood-stained monuments of cities they destroy rather than just whatever they can get their hands on after the fact. I don't know, they're kinda assholes already. The biggest consistency with them and humanoid vampires though is of course their bite attack. It obviously does a lot more damage and has a much higher saving throw, but is otherwise the same aside from the fact that a vampire dragon can turn other dragons into vampires, not just humanoids who are resilient enough to not outright get crushed between the vampire's jaws when they take a bite. In the event that the dragon should use its bite to kill another dragon who is not yet entirely matured, the victim does still rise as an undead creature, though rather than a vampire, they rise as a zombie dragon under the biter's control. Zombie dragons are slower, dumber, and lack access to their breath weapon, but are very much still dragons, so that's no good for anybody, but we'll get into that in a minute here. The first big change I made to the vampire dragon is one that not only makes the creature much more interesting in my humble opinion, but also incredibly dangerous, even more so than they already were. In the original book, a vampire dragon's breath weapon was the same as whatever it had in life. So a red vampire dragon would breathe fire, a green vampire dragon would breathe poison, etc. And I couldn't help but feel like that was super lame. So I gave this dragon two brand new breath weapons hot off the press, the first of which is called Misty Breath. Playing off the connection between vampires and mist, especially in D&D, I felt like this dragon being able to exhale a big old cloud of fog that obscures the area and causes a bit of cold damage was very fitting. The mist lingers for a full minute and causes anyone who starts their turn inside of it to take a smidge more cold damage, because I'm a huge sucker for monster effects and spells that alter the battlefield. Also, as a dragon, it's got blind sight, so that goes crazy. Now this ability recharges on a 5 or a 6 like pretty much every other dragon's breath attack, but I also gave it a second breath weapon that was so powerful I relegated it to only being able to be used once per day in an action I called Siphoning Breath. This attack forces a Constitution saving throw from everyone in a 60-foot cone, and of course creatures who have been bloodied, meaning they're at half HP or less, have disadvantage on said save. All creatures in the area take a ton of necrotic damage, saving for half, and have their maximum HP decreased by the amount of damage taken. And the dragon heals for half of that amount as it coaxes the blood in its enemy out of their body and into their mouth. Just the imagery of blood evaporating from every scratch, cut, and pore as the dragon pulls it in is so horrible, menacing, and overall exactly what I want from a vampire dragon. Keeping with the new dragon design philosophy, I also gave this guy a handful of spells such as Charm Monster, Disguise Self, and Shape Change so that it can easily achieve all manner of vampire shenanigantery. It's also got Chill Touch, which it can use to replace one of its attacks if it so chooses, in order to prevent that target that it hits from regaining hit points, which is super mean, but also awesome. Lastly, I gave them a once per day casting of Mass Suggestion, because if a regular vampire can easily sway the mind of a single creature, a vampire dragon should be able to do that in more grandiose fashion. All in all, this creature is exactly what it says on the box, a dragon with the power of a vampire cranked up to 11, and its own physiology morphed in such a way as to evoke the accursed undeath all vampires find themselves embroiled in. But how would you even use this guy in a campaign? Well, I think there are tons of dramatic and thematically evocative applications, and some really funny ones. For example, while a vampire dragon might still be subject to the rule of forbiddance, requiring permission to enter someone's home, there is a direct quote from the book which reads, "They can't enter a home unless invited, but most simply destroy the home and then pick through the rubbish for their victims." This is so funny to me. I love that that is in this book. It gives off incredible Air Bud energy. Like, sure, they can't just enter your home, but there ain't no rule that says they can't rip apart the walls.
Ain't no rules in the dog can't play basketball.
Generally, the idea of a vampire plotline where the main antagonist is a vampire dragon pretending to be a humanoid vampire, pretending to be a living human, is also hilarious to me and potentially really awesome.
I'm a dude playing a dude disguised as another dude.
Just imagine the surprise of your players when during the big confrontation with this vampire lord, they have him backed into a corner, and just when they think they've got him, the vampire drops form and reverts into a bona fide dragon. This is now my new favorite way to insert another twist into Curse of Strahd. Another high point for this creature in terms of its minions comes from Rime of the Frost Maiden of all places. I won't get into specifics here in case any of you are actively playing in an Icewind Dale campaign, but in the bestiary of the adventure, there are kobold vampire spawn stat blocks. So not only could you have a dragon with all manner of humanoid vampire spawn and familiars, but there are also existing rules for your vampiric kobolds that you can use, and I think that's great. I also think the blood elemental, which I did a video on during Spooky Month a couple of years back, could make for a fantastic layer guardian or some other kind of minion. Because ultimately, you either want to play this monster in a way that is super cagey and keeps the players guessing even when they think they've got it figured out, or you want them to be a complete tyrant, too powerful and self-assured to bother with any subterfuge. A vampire dragon being heralded by a swarm of kobolds who are all vampire spawn, swarming a city before the dragon arrives, is a truly terrifying prospect and could make for an awesome villain introduction. Maybe this dragon is not only creating undead kobolds and humanoids to serve its whims, but going after other dragons in order to create a cabal of vampiric dragons, all subservient to it, or even transforming weaker dragons into zombies that it can control and use as brute force soldiers in whatever war it seeks to wage. Or, like I said, you go with the subtle route. You could have the dragon masquerading as whatever type of dragon it was in life with relative ease. Maybe you have a noble silver dragon turned vampire, and the creature just uses disguise self to seem as though nothing has changed, while beneath the surface, its scales have lost their sheen, and its kind disposition has been replaced with a cruel and cunning bloodthirst. Because these creatures can change their appearance both subtly and entirely into a beast or humanoid creature, for example, they can easily fit into any existing vampire plot lines or tropes, albeit with a much more dramatic reveal than a mere human-sized set of fangs. I also love the idea that this dragon might exist as the result of a vengeful vampire. Perhaps a court of standard vampires cast out one of their members for some wrongdoing, and as vengeance, that vampire went and turned a dragon, either using the dragon as a tool to exact its will, which is sure to end poorly, or possibly even just as a means of unleashing an apex predator on a city where these other vampires dwell. The players might end up caught in the middle of a vampire cabal fighting a vampire dragon with plenty of drama and infighting along the way, which could be a really fun way to give them a chance to work with the devil they know against the tyrant they don't. But at the end of the day, I think vampires are super cool, they can make fantastic villains, and a vampire dragon combines all my love for vampires with one of the most iconic creatures in D&D. So that's a win in my book. As always, if you do want to use this monster in your game, linked in the description down below is the 5e stat block conversion, which is completely free, available to anyone. And if you are one of my lovely patrons over on the Dungeon Dad Patreon page, you will find the Dungeon Dad PDF stat block, which contains all the same game information, but it's got a nicer layout, the cool new artwork, which was done by Dakota Curry this week. It looks fantastic and helps support me in the show and lets us keep doing what we're doing here. Thank you so much to all of you guys who do support me over there. I literally could not do this show without you. And a special thank you goes out to this week's randomly selected Patron of the Week. Thank you so much to Slutus, who, as it turns out, is the longest standing supporter on the Dungeon Dad channel. So thank you for your literal years of support. I truly do appreciate it. Thank you for watching. As always, if there's a monster you would like to see show up in a future episode of Monster of the Week, let me know in the comments down below or in the Dungeon Dad Discord, which is also linked in the description down below. And who knows? You might just see it show up in a future episode of Monster of the Week. This is now the second vampire we've talked about over the course of Spooky Month, which is cool, but I can assure you that we are done with vampires. So for the vampire enthusiasts in the room, suck it up. You got 2 of them. That wasn't meant to be a pun, but also it kind of was, so good for me. For those of you who are not super keen on vampires or just want to see some variety, we got 3 more videos coming out in October, and they're all going to be different varieties of spooky or horror-related monsters, and I am very excited to share them all with you. But we'll get to all of that in due time, and I'll see you next week. Till then.